Imagine that you could travel back in time about 50,000 years. You step out of your shelter just as dawn begins to break. Cold air blankets the vast grasslands of the Ice Age. In the distance, a group of people is building a fire. They know how to craft stone tools. They know how to hunt. They care for their children. They bury their dead. They may even tell stories. Perhaps they can sing. But they are not Homo sapiens. If you continue walking for a few more days, you will encounter another group of humans. Shorter, more heavily built, with larger heads, better adapted to freezing climates. Elsewhere, you might encounter yet another entirely different human species, one whose existence modern science only uncovered a few years ago through traces hidden within ancient DNA. It sounds almost unbelievable, but there was once a time in Earth's history when our planet was not home to just one human species. At least 6, perhaps even more, existed side by side. Each followed its own evolutionary path. Each knew how to make tools. Each was intelligent enough to survive in extraordinarily harsh environments. So what happened? Why is it that today, when you look into the mirror, you see only one face? The face of Homo sapiens? Where did the Neanderthals go? How did the Denisovans disappear? What became of Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, and the many other branches of humanity whose fossils still remain? Did our ancestors defeat them in war? Or were they simply luckier? Or is the real answer far more complex? So complex that it completely changes the way we understand ourselves. For decades, scientists believed that Homo sapiens survived because we were simply more intelligent. But the more fossils they uncovered, the more ancient genomes they decoded, the more complicated the picture became. Perhaps Homo sapiens was not the strongest species, not the most physically powerful. Perhaps we were not even the most intelligent in every respect. So why are we the only ones left? The answer will lead us through encounters between different human species, moments of interbreeding whose traces still remain in the DNA of billions of people today, dramatic climate shifts, revolutionary cultural breakthroughs, and a chain of seemingly small events powerful enough to change the destiny of all humanity. This is the story of how Homo sapiens became the last surviving human species. Today, when we speak about humans, we almost automatically think of a single species, Homo sapiens. That makes it remarkably easy to forget that. For most of human evolutionary history, reality looked nothing like that. For millions of years, Earth resembled a forest filled with many different branches of humanity living side by side. Some appeared, some evolved, some disappeared, and new branches continued to emerge. If you were to look at the human evolutionary tree, Homo sapiens would be nothing more than the single surviving leaf on what was once an incredibly lush and complex branch. Around 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers farther north, the Neanderthals had already been living across Europe and Western Asia for a very long time. They were perfectly adapted to the freezing Ice Age climate, with short, powerfully built bodies, broad chests, and muscles stronger than those of modern humans. Farther east, in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, another human species was also living. We did not even know they existed until 2010, when scientists analyzed DNA extracted from a tiny finger bone discovered inside Denisova cave. They became known as the Denisovans. What is truly astonishing is that without modern DNA sequencing technology, we might never have known they had ever existed. In Indonesia, on the island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered the fossils of another human species standing only about 1 meter tall. They were named Homo floresiensis. Many people affectionately call them the hobbits. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the skeletons of Homo naledi revealed a human species with a relatively small brain that nevertheless appears to have displayed surprisingly complex social behavior. And that list is not even complete. With every passing decade, archaeology continues adding new pieces to the puzzle, making the human family tree richer and more diverse than we ever imagined. This leads us to a surprising truth. For most of our history, Homo sapiens was never the human. We were simply one of many human species sharing this planet. If you had lived about 50,000 years ago, encountering another human species might have seemed as ordinary as meeting people who spoke a different language today. But here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. For many years, scientists imagined those encounters as meetings between completely separate animal species. They assumed each human species occupied its own territory and rarely came into contact with the others. Today, the evidence tells a completely different story. They did not merely encounter one another. They did not merely observe one another. They left pieces of themselves inside our own bodies. And those traces have completely transformed the scientific understanding of human history. For centuries, humanity has loved stories about victors. And in those stories, Homo sapiens has often been portrayed as the superior warrior that defeated every other human species. It is an incredibly compelling image. But modern science tells a completely different story. In 2010, when geneticists successfully decoded the Neanderthal genome for the very first time, they discovered something that stunned the scientific world. If your ancestry comes from Europe or Asia, there is a very good chance that between 1 and 2% of your DNA today came from Neanderthals. That could hardly be possible if the two species had met only on battlefields. It could only happen if they had children together. In other words, when Homo sapiens left Africa and entered the Middle East around 60 to 70,000 years ago, they were not stepping into an empty wilderness. They were entering the homeland of other human species. The Neanderthals had already lived there for hundreds of thousands of years. Instead of only competing, the two species met, observed one another, learned from one another, and sometimes fell in love. Today, traces of those encounters still remain within the bodies of billions of people. Certain segments of Neanderthal DNA strengthen our immune system against unfamiliar pathogens in Europe and Asia. Other genetic variants helped humans adapt to colder climates. Still others influence skin color, hair color, or the way our bodies respond to ultraviolet radiation. Not every inheritance, however, was beneficial. Some ancient DNA variants are also associated with an increased risk of autoimmune diseases, allergies, or overly aggressive immune responses. That reminds us that evolution has never been perfect. It simply preserved whatever proved useful under the circumstances of the time. Even more fascinating, the Neanderthals were not the only human species to leave their mark on us. Across Asia and Oceania, especially in Papua, New Guinea, and parts of Melanesia, modern humans carry between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA. Those genetic fragments helped humans adapt to some of the most extreme environments on Earth. The most famous example is the people of Tibet. A genetic variant inherited from the Denisovans allows them to live healthily at elevations above 4,000 meters, where oxygen levels are only about 60% of those at sea level. That means whenever we look at our own genome, we are not seeing only the history of Homo sapiens. We are seeing the combined history of multiple human species that once met, interbred, and each contributed a chapter to the evolutionary story of humanity. So if they were similar enough to have children together, if they were intelligent enough to make tools, if they all hunted, cared for their families, and adapted successfully to nature, then why did only one species ultimately remain? Was Homo sapiens truly superior? Or did the decisive advantage lie somewhere no one expected? For many years, people believed that Homo sapiens prevailed simply because we were more intelligent. It sounds reasonable. But the more scientists studied the evidence, the more they realized the story was far more complicated. In fact, if we judge only by brain size, the Neanderthals may even have held the advantage. On average, their brains were slightly larger than those of modern humans. They crafted extraordinarily sophisticated stone tools. They mastered fire. They hunted gigantic animals such as bison, ancient elephants, and woolly rhinoceroses. They cared for injured members of their communities for years. Many fossils reveal individuals who had lost an arm or suffered broken legs, yet continued living for a long time afterward. Clear evidence that their communities cared for one another. They buried their dead. They may have worn jewelry. They may have produced colored pigments. Some evidence even suggests they carved simple designs into stone. In other words, Neanderthals were never the stupid cavemen that popular culture once portrayed. They were truly human, intelligent, adaptable, resilient. So where did the advantage of Homo sapiens actually lie? Many anthropologists believe the answer was not found within individuals. It existed at the scale of entire communities. Imagine two groups of humans living several hundred kilometers apart. The first shares knowledge only within its own family or tribe. The second regularly meets neighboring communities to exchange tools, raw materials, hunting experience, and even marriage partners. At first, the difference seems almost insignificant, but after hundreds of generations, that gap becomes enormous. An invention made in one group can quickly spread to dozens of others. A new hunting technique, a more effective spear point, a better way to start fires in wet conditions, a method for preserving food. Each new idea is no longer confined to one small community. It becomes the shared property of an entire network. Scientists call this cumulative culture. Unlike many other animals, humans do not simply learn from previous generations. We continually improve upon what we inherit. One person creates the very first spear. The next makes it lighter. A later generation attaches a sharper stone tip. Then someone else invents an adhesive that secures the spearhead more firmly. Across thousands of years, those tiny improvements accumulate into enormous leaps forward. No single individual invented that entire technology. It was the product of hundreds, indeed thousands, of minds building upon one another across countless generations. Perhaps that was the true advantage of Homo sapiens, not a larger brain, but the ability to connect many brains into one immense learning system. And when Earth's climate began changing rapidly, that very system would face its greatest test yet. A test that not every human species could survive. Around 45 to 40,000 years ago, Earth entered an era of extraordinary instability. The climate did not simply become steadily warmer or steadily colder. It fluctuated, abruptly, unpredictably. During some periods, temperatures plummeted dramatically within only a few decades. Vast grasslands transformed into frozen landscapes. Forests retreated. Animal herds migrated along entirely new routes. For any predator, it was a disaster. But for the different human species, it became the ultimate test of adaptability. Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years evolving into specialists perfectly suited to Ice Age Europe. Their short, stocky bodies conserved heat efficiently. Their broad chests supported breathing in freezing air. Their powerful muscles allowed them to confront and bring down enormous prey at close range. That strategy worked remarkably well, until the environment began changing too quickly. As mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses became increasingly scarce, every hunt grew more dangerous. One fall, one deep wound, one broken bone. Any one of those could cost an entire group one of its most valuable hunters. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens appears to have chosen a different path. They did not depend entirely on one type of prey. When large animals became scarce, they hunted smaller ones. When hunting failed, they fished. They gathered wild fruits, grass seeds, roots, shellfish, and every food source the environment still provided. That diverse diet did more than reduce the risk of starvation. It also made them far more flexible when nature changed. Technology, too, began widening the gap. Lighter spears, thinner stone blades, bone needles used to sew tightly fitted clothing, adhesives that made spearheads stronger and more durable. No single invention was revolutionary enough to transform history overnight, but hundreds of small improvements accumulated generation after generation, creating an advantage that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Most importantly, Homo sapiens appears to have maintained extensive exchange networks connecting many different communities. High-quality stones suitable for making tools could travel hundreds of kilometers. Seashells from coastal regions have been discovered deep inland. Mineral pigments appear in locations far from their original sources. All of this suggests that humans were no longer living as isolated groups. They had begun to form interconnected networks stretching across vast territories. If one community suffered disaster, others could provide support. If one region ran out of food, information about new lands could spread. In a constantly changing world, the greatest advantage was no longer the strength of any individual. It was the adaptability of the entire system. Even so, one question continues to fuel scientific debate. If Homo sapiens possessed so many advantages, why do we still carry Neanderthal DNA within our bodies? That means the two species did far more than compete. They lived alongside one another for a very long time. So what ultimately caused one species to disappear while the other survived? The image we are most familiar with from movies is usually very simple. Two groups of humans, two spears, one decisive battle. The victor survives. The loser disappears forever. It is a captivating story. But real history most likely unfolded very differently. To this day, archaeology has found no convincing evidence that Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals ever fought a large-scale war against one another. There are skeletons bearing signs of injuries, broken spear points, deaths caused by violence. But the evidence is far too limited to conclude that the two species waged a prolonged war aimed at wiping each other out. Instead, scientists are increasingly drawn to another explanation. The Neanderthals did not disappear in a single moment. Gradually, they were absorbed into a much larger population. Imagine two rivers flowing together. One is enormous. The other is much smaller. For a while, you can still see the waters of both rivers mixing together. But the farther downstream you travel, the smaller river slowly loses its own name. Not because it vanished, but because it became part of the larger river. Perhaps the history of the Neanderthals unfolded in much the same way. For thousands of years, they encountered Homo sapiens. Some communities competed. Some avoided one another. Some exchanged tools. And some built families together. Every time a child of mixed ancestry was born, the distance between the two species grew just a little smaller. Across hundreds of generations, part of the Neanderthal legacy continued to survive. But as a distinct human species, their numbers steadily declined. That does not mean every encounter was peaceful. When two groups hunted across the same land, drew water from the same sources, or sheltered inside the same cave, conflict was almost certainly inevitable. But perhaps those conflicts resembled competition between neighboring communities rather than a war intended to exterminate an entire species. More importantly, Homo sapiens possessed one crucial advantage: population scale. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained much broader social networks, connecting numerous communities across vast distances, that allowed the Homo sapiens population to grow far more rapidly. If one group suffered a tragedy, others could replenish its members. Meanwhile, if a small Neanderthal community lost only a handful of adults to disease, accidents, or food shortages, it might never recover. Over time, that imbalance became greater and greater, not because of a single battle, but because of the mathematics of population. Large populations are naturally more resilient when confronted with environmental change. Small populations are far more vulnerable to spiraling decline. Eventually, there were simply too few Neanderthals left to preserve their identity as a separate species. But that does not mean they disappeared completely. Every time a modern human carrying a fragment of Neanderthal DNA is born, that history continues. In a very real sense, the Neanderthals never truly left this world. They are still alive, within each of us. And that leads to an even deeper question. If Homo sapiens did not prevail through war, if we did not prevail through superior strength, then could our decisive advantage have been an invisible ability that every modern human uses every single day without even noticing? Imagine yourself living 45,000 years ago. You need to cooperate with 20 other people to hunt a herd of bison. If all you have are cries and simple gestures, you might communicate, "There are animals. Follow me. Danger." But that is where communication ends. Now imagine being able to say something far more complex. Tomorrow, when the sun reaches the top of the hill, the herd will pass through the eastern valley. We'll divide into 3 groups. The first group will drive them toward the cliff. The second will block their escape. The third will wait beside the stream. That is no longer simple communication. That is planning. The ability to speak about events that have not yet happened completely transformed the way humans cooperated. Many scientists consider this one of the greatest turning points in evolutionary history, because from that moment onward, the human brain no longer reacted only to the present. It began constructing the future. But language accomplished even more than that. It allowed us to share things that no one could ever see. A story, a belief, a law, a promise, or even a god. No one can hold a promise in their hands. No one can see trust with their eyes. Yet millions of people willingly cooperate because they all believe in those invisible ideas. Almost no other animal can do that. A wolf pack may cooperate extraordinarily well, but it is difficult to imagine two unfamiliar wolf packs working together simply because they share the same story. Humans can. Two groups that have never met before can exchange food if they believe in the same rules. They can share territory, exchange marriage partners, protect one another from greater dangers. That extraordinary capacity for cooperation expands from a few dozen individuals to hundreds, then thousands, and eventually millions. Perhaps this was the greatest difference between Homo sapiens and every other human species. Not muscle, not brain size, but the ability to create shared realities within our minds. A flag, a symbol, a story about our ancestors, a ritual, a belief that all of us belong to the same community. These ideas may sound abstract, yet they inspired complete strangers to help one another. And as communities continued growing larger, the accumulation of knowledge accelerated at an unprecedented pace. An invention made in one place could spread somewhere else. A brilliant idea no longer died with the person who first imagined it. Instead, it continued evolving across generations. That is why Homo sapiens did not merely adapt to the world. We began transforming the world itself. But if every advantage seemed to favor Homo sapiens, why did the disappearance of the Neanderthals still take thousands of years? That alone tells us they were never weak opponents. Quite the opposite. They endured far longer than we once imagined. And it is during those final millennia that we discover perhaps the greatest lesson about the fragility of every human species that has ever lived on Earth. There is a very common tendency when we look back at history. We often assume that the species which survived must have been superior to the ones that disappeared. But evolution is rarely that simple. Imagine two mountain climbers. One is stronger. The other is faster. Yet just as they approach the summit, an unexpected avalanche crashes down. The survivor is not necessarily the strongest. Sometimes, it is simply the one standing in the right place at the right moment. The story of Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals may have been much the same. Around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals had already lived across Europe for more than 300,000 years. They had survived countless ice age cycles. They endured periods during which many other animal species disappeared entirely. Clearly, they were not a weak or inferior species. But this time, everything was different. The climate continued to fluctuate. Food sources shifted. And at the same time, a new human species appeared on their very homeland. It was not one single catastrophe. It was many different pressures arriving within a relatively short period of time. The Neanderthal population had never been very large. Genetic research suggests they lived in small, relatively isolated communities. When one of those groups lost a few adults to famine, disease, or accidents, recovery became extraordinarily difficult. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens appears to have maintained much broader social networks. One community could receive new members from another. New inventions continued spreading. New territories were constantly explored. The difference between the two species did not necessarily lie within individuals. It lay in the resilience of the population as a whole. In biology, this is known as system resilience. The more connections a system has, the harder it is for the entire system to collapse. If one link breaks, the remaining links continue functioning. Perhaps Homo sapiens did not survive because each individual was better. Perhaps we survived because our communities were better at absorbing repeated shocks. That is a lesson that remains just as relevant today. Civilizations do not endure solely because of a handful of extraordinary individuals. They endure because they can share knowledge, support one another, and adapt when the world changes. There is another detail that is worth reflecting upon. If the Neanderthals had truly been inferior, they would have disappeared hundreds of thousands of years earlier. But they did not. They lived alongside Homo sapiens for thousands of years. They hunted the same prey. They endured the same winters. They loved their families. They cared for their elderly and their children. In many ways, they were human too. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story is that the Neanderthals did not fail because they did something wrong. They simply faced a world that was changing faster than they themselves could adapt. That brings us to one final question. If only Homo sapiens survived, can we truly call ourselves the winners of history? Or are we simply the last survivors, carrying with us the memories of every human species that came before? Perhaps the greatest question this story leaves us with is no longer why the Neanderthals disappeared. Instead, it is this: how should we see them? For a very long time, textbooks described human history as though it were a race. Many species began at the starting line. Only one reached the finish. Homo sapiens was declared the winner. But the more anthropologists study our past, the more they realize that picture is far too simple. Evolution is not a competition with a gold medal waiting at the end. It is much more like a tree. Each branch grows in its own direction. Some branches wither. Some are broken by storms. Only one branch continues reaching toward the sky. That does not make the branches that were lost meaningless. Quite the opposite. They are what gave the entire tree its shape. The Neanderthals were never a failed version of Homo sapiens. The Denisovans were not either. Each represented a different solution to the very same challenge posed by nature. How can a species of primate survive in a world that never stops changing? The Neanderthals chose the path of physical strength and adaptation to freezing climates. The Denisovans evolved traits suited to the mountains and harsh environments of Asia. Homo floresiensis adapted to life on isolated islands. And Homo sapiens, we chose a different path. Instead of changing our bodies more quickly, we changed our ideas more quickly. When the environment changed, we did not wait thousands of years for a new biological adaptation to evolve. We created better tools. We sewed better clothing. We built better shelters. We discovered new food sources. We invented new ways to cooperate. That was the moment when culture began moving faster than biology. With every generation, humans passed down far more than genes. We passed down experience, knowledge, beliefs, and even our mistakes. Perhaps that was the greatest invention in the entire history of evolution. Not the wheel, not agriculture, not even metal, but the ability to ensure that the knowledge of one generation did not disappear when that generation was gone. That single ability allowed Homo sapiens to accumulate knowledge faster than any other human species ever could. And tens of thousands of years later, we began building villages, then cities, then civilizations, then science, then ships that crossed entire oceans, then telescopes, then spacecraft. The remarkable thing is that every time we launch another probe toward Mars or decode another fragment of ancient DNA, we are not only exploring the future, we are also rediscovering the relatives who once walked beside us on humanity's evolutionary journey. Perhaps the Neanderthals never truly left history. They still exist within the genomes of billions of people, within the lessons that science continues to uncover, and within the reminder that the survival of Homo sapiens was never inevitable. If the climate had changed differently, if a few migrations had never happened, if the first networks of cooperation had never formed, perhaps no one would be here today to tell this story. Human history, then, is not the story of one great conqueror. It is the story of many human species that together wrote one of the greatest chapters in the history of Earth. And Homo sapiens is simply the final chapter that is still being written. Across nearly 7 million years of human evolution, dozens of branches appeared and disappeared. Only Homo sapiens remains today. But that does not mean we were the strongest or the most perfect species. We are the descendants of communities that learned, cooperated, and passed knowledge from one generation to the next more effectively than any other human species. Every time you look into a mirror, remember that you are not carrying only the story of Homo sapiens. Within the DNA of billions of people still remain the traces of the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, a reminder that the history of humanity has never been the story of just one species. If this video has given you a new perspective on human history, leave a comment below. What do you think was the single most important factor that determined the fate of Homo sapiens? And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can join us on our next journey of discovery. In our next video, we'll explore an even more controversial question. Why are humans the only animals that can truly speak? It is not merely the story of language. It is the story of how one seemingly ordinary ability transformed the entire course of human evolution, allowing our species to build civilizations, create religions, develop science, produce art, and ultimately become the dominant species on our planet.